Shalom to the elect of Israel, to the hopeful elect of Israel, you Hebrew Israelites, you so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, West Indians, and Haitians. Got to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashim Yahweh Shah. The Most High, the Heavenly Father, his Hebrew name is Yahweh. Not Yahweh, not Jehovah, not God, not Elohim, not Most High, not Lord, not Yah, not Jah, not Ahaya, not Allah, not Abba, not Yahuwah, not Hashem, not Yahweh, Haveh, Vaveh. It's Yahweh. And his only begotten son name in the Hebrew is Yahweh Shah. Not Yahshua, not Yeshua, not Jesus Christos, not Jesus Christ, not Serapis Christos, not Yeshaya, not Yehoshua, not Yahusha, not Yeshua, not Jesus Christos. It's Yahweh Shah. So we got to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashim Yahweh Shah, Bahashim Rekah Kodash. Double honors to the apostles, elder, bishop, elders of great millstone, over well, who teach well, who are the apostles and elders of all of Israel, whether accepted or not. 144, Kala Yahbashim Shah. In a sense, it's salutation to all that I can believe in this truth and pushing this truth with the four winds of the earth. The entire world shall light to the hopeful elect. Shalom to the Akwath who are listening learning. If you sis who are listening learning. I'm Isaiah from GMS Atlanta Camp. Prophet of Doom coming at you on a lesson, truth, facts, faith, and edification. Another day of edification, Lord, will be edified. So this is copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing non-profit, educational, personal use tilt the balance in favor of fair use. This is for educational purposes only. This is not for monetary gain. I do not own a copyright to these videos. This is for educational purposes only. Lord willing, this be edifying. And this is the prophecies. This is the prophecy of the Idumeans. The prophecy of the Idumeans fall being spoken of and televised. Lord willing, be edifying. And this is going to be a long one. So if you ain't in for the long run, this ain't for you. But this is some heavy information that's going out. Lord willing, be edifying. Check this out.
Raymond Aron, the great international relations scholar of France, said that small countries do what they must, large countries do what they can. If you're a small country like Israel, then it is in your interest to make your problems America's problems, to make your threats America's threats. And that's what he's about. He's trying to convince everyone that if for some reason we fail to support Israel's bid to ultimately destroy Iran, to balkanize it, to destroy its government, to effectively remove it, as some of the more neocon scholars would say, remove it from the great chessboard. If we don't do those things, then the world as we know it ends, and we're the next targets. This is not a new ploy. This is a very old ploy. Unfortunately, it's worked rather well for them to this point. The question is, will it work much longer? I rather doubt it. And I don't see any evidence for any interest in Iran in launching ICBMs with nuclear warheads, even if they had them in any considerable strength or numbers, against the United States. I mean, we've lived with this balance of terror with the Soviet Union and now today Russia, and previously with the Chinese for some time. No one is interested in turning their respective country into glass by attacking the United States of America. So that's all complete and utter nonsense. But we've lost the sense, and I think this is the problem that we have with President Trump and everybody in Washington. We've lost the sense that the most critical thing we can do in foreign and defense policy is avoid war. On the contrary, we seem to be in the hunt for additional wars. We don't have enough as it is.
Well, it certainly seems that we have been on that path, and it certainly seems that we're on the path to going back to here. And going back to that interview with Professor Morandi with Rachel Blevins, he seems to think that Israel is flat out planning on one.
It is also believed by some that Trump would like to have a lull in the hostility so that the Israelis could have a freer hand in carrying out a new war against Iran. That is a possibility. We'll have to wait and see. We don't know, but it is clear that the American and Israeli regimes are working together to prepare the regime for another war. And that is quite extraordinary if one takes into account the fact that the United States claims that it has, as Trump repeatedly says, obliterated Iran's peaceful nuclear program, which of course was an act of war and barbaric and inhumane, that aside. But they don't have an excuse based on Trump's own claims to attack Iran again. But they seem to be preparing for that.
So they do seem to be preparing for that. In case you had any wonders, he mentioned something about Trump there, and I want to play this clip. We got a couple here, but I'm going to start off with this one from President Trump speaking at the commemoration of the Navy here just a little bit ago, and he brought up the issue of Iran.
Spectacular military feats the world has ever seen, the obliteration of Iran's nuclear sites in Operation Midnight Hammer. How did that work out? Pretty good, right? And we shot 30 Tomahawks, you know that. On top of, after the B-2, how about that? The B-2s, what they did, those beautiful flying wings, what they did, they hit every single target they hit. And just in case, we shot 30 Tomahawks out of a submarine, every one of them hit too. So I would say Iran was not particularly thrilled. They were going to have a nuclear weapon within a month. And now they can start the operation all over again, but I hope they don't, because we'll have to take care of that too if they do. I let them know that you want to do that, it's fine, but we're going to take care of that, and we're not going to wait so long. It should have been done long before I came along.
So that last part there is kind of what got my attention, except next time we're not going to wait so long. How do you interpret that?
Well, it's pretty hard to miss, isn't it, Dan? I think he's, once again, the perpetual marketer. He loves to market himself, and he uses whatever he can to market American military power. He places American military power at the head of the list of instrumentalities for the advancement of whatever interest he thinks is important. We have no interest in the destruction of Iran. We never have. As far as we know, though the Iranians may very well have the capability to build nuclear warheads, there's no evidence right now that they have any. And they made it pretty clear that they would rather not leave the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty Organization. So we have to take that with a grain of salt. But unfortunately, this is something that he enjoys talking about. As we've discussed it before, for people overseas, it's very hard to sort truth from fiction, imagination from reality when President Trump speaks. He may want to cultivate a positive image for the United States, but what he does, unfortunately, is demonstrate that he's reckless, he's impulsive, and he's quite capable of taking action that is devastating on the world stage. That's all he did in that speech. You know, we've got these marvelous flying wings. They can show up in the middle of the night anywhere in the world and destroy everything beneath them. Well, at the moment, he's gotten away with that. Is that the future? I don't think so. And do we want that as a future? Because, you know, somebody said many years ago, cast your bread upon the waters, and in a few days it will return manyfold unto you. I think he's on a dangerous path. I think the world is increasingly sick of us. And that's how you get BRICS. That's how you get parallel financial institutions. That's why we're in a lot of trouble right now, because we are financially fragile and economically weak. And the world is beginning to figure it out. It's only a matter of time until this military hammer that he's talking about is exposed for what it is. It's an instrument, but it is by no means without countermeasures.
Hey, so when we listen to these videos, we listen to everything that they say, and we filter it through the scriptures. So you heard him mention the hammer. He mentioned America, Babylon the Great. He said the hammer, which is Jeremiah 50 and 23. We listen to what these Edomites say, and we filter it through the scriptures. Now, the title of this video is Israel Pulls America In, War with Iran. Right? War with Iran trap. I got others.
Went through a difficult period.
Let's play this one here next.
I think it's very clear that we have no coherent national strategy of any kind.
Play this one here.
Whether it's military, scientific, industrial, economic, it doesn't matter. There is no coherent military strategy at all, no coherent national strategy. As a result, we go through these convulsive periods that alternate between euphoria and despair. And we wake up, as we have recently within the last 24 hours, to discover that once again, channels other than those that we are accustomed to, in other words, involving this man,
and Colonel Douglas McGregor, is the spokesperson. He's the spokesman.
Witkoff, the real estate billionaire who is friends with President Trump,
he's the spokesman for the
seems to have been at work behind the scenes to try and craft some sort of solution that both President Putin and President Trump could support for Ukraine. Now, there's people are talking about 20-point plan and all sorts of things. I really don't know the details. And unless you are on the inside of this little cabal in the White House that cooks these things up and then is blessed by Trump to implement them, you really don't know the details. The only thing we can say is that President Trump wants to end the war, but he wants certain things. And people need to understand this about him. This applies to any discussions, as you've already seen, between Azerbaijan and Armenia. He wants to be seen as having been the great bringer of peace, goodness, and wonderful things. In other words, the optics have to be flattering to Donald Trump. He has to appear to be the main driving force behind whatever occurs. I think Mr. Putin has frankly accommodated this for a long time because he too would like to see the war end. He is by no means desperate per se, but he would also like to have a better relationship with Washington. And so if he can sign on for something that brings the fighting in Ukraine to an end, but at the same time establishes a new and more positive relationship with Washington, I'm sure that Mr. Putin will try to achieve that. Now, beyond that, what does it mean? Does it have legs? Will it work? Who knows? I mean, the regime inside Kiev is arguably one of the most corrupt and despicable regimes in modern human history. I mean, our friend Zelensky has stolen over $1 billion in cash, sitting in multiple bank accounts in various places. There have been rumors lately that he's prepared to leave the country on a moment's notice. People thought he might not come back from his trip to Greece. Two of his inner circle members, if you will, one was named Mindich, who is a sort of a financial guru for Mr. Zelensky. Another gentleman whose name escapes me. Both fled to Israel because, as Jews, they cannot be extradited. Mr. Zelensky is also Jewish, so I don't think we should rule out the possibility that he flies to Israel to cover himself and conceal himself from public view when the time comes. Who knows? I, for one, would like to see an end to the war because it's pointless. It has never made any real sense. And the Ukrainian nation, per se, has been destroyed.
Yes.
This is something people don't understand. I mean, it really has. The deaths are in the millions, refugees in the millions. We don't know whether or not there will even be a Ukraine once the fighting ends. Now, the question is, what will Russia accept? Can Russia live with a regime in Kiev that is hostile to it? I don't think so. Can they live with this sort of bizarre Zelensky character or successors from his regime who are going to continue, and frankly speaking, providing cover to NATO to place weapons and other things on Ukrainian soil? We don't know any of this. All of these things have to be addressed, and Witkoff apparently is in the business of addressing them. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But don't exclude the possibility that it all of a sudden simply collapses. Unfortunately, that's the world we live in. And you know what they say when you have no strategy? It's sort of like saying, well, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there.
Well, yeah, quite. So if we want to build a conjecture about the possible terms for this peace agreement, I mean, Crimea is probably not something that Russia is going to negotiate.
No.
The four regions are probably something that they will probably not negotiate. So would it be sensible to say that perhaps there would be an agreement to freeze the current front line, and then, but then would it not make sense to make sure that on the other side of that front line there would not be a huge military buildup? Because I don't think some people in Europe would waste a second until they start building factories and importing military equipment and military technologies, and Russians would probably do the same. So we'll just freeze the conflict to turn it into a big barrel, a gunpowder barrel that will explode in a few years, and probably in a much worse way. Is there a way to prevent this from happening?
This is the question that none of us can answer at this point. Clearly, from the Russian standpoint, you've argued for a very, very stringent outcome. You cannot end this war and allow the remnants of this regime to survive intact. I just don't think you can. You've got to have some kind of house cleaning. You need, we could certainly hold elections in Ukraine. All sorts of things can change. But what will the Europeans do? The Europeans don't have much to do anything with. I mean, militarily, they have no impact. It's ridiculous. Now, they can provide Storm Shadow missiles or Taurus cruise missiles or something, and that's more of an irritant than a strategic game changer. But it's still a problem, because the Russians are not going to put up with that for very long. And I think the Europeans, frankly, when I say Europeans, I should stop and say not Europeans, but the globalist elites governing Europe. Because I think the French, the British, the Germans, and others in Europe have had it with the EU and NATO, to be perfectly blunt. I think those two institutions will crumble and go out of existence whenever this fighting really finally ends. It doesn't have any future. But having said that, I think the globalists would like to perpetuate in any way possible hostility with Russia, because that, in their minds, helps to justify their positions in power. I mean, how could you turn around if you're Merz or Macron or Starmer and say, oh, by the way, we were wrong. Russia really isn't the threat we said it was. The Russians are not coming west. They're not going to.
So the Colonel mentions in these videos that I'm playing how America don't use no strategy, don't have no integrity. They don't make advice. They don't use advice before they make war, which I'm going to get all the precepts on these. I was listening to these videos and I was taking my notes, because everything these Edomites say is already in the scriptures. The scriptures are written in 4-time code for our learning. So this is Yahweh Shema Shai. As it said in Isaiah 44:26, he's confirming the word of his servant, and he's performing the counsel of his messengers. So everything that this guy says in these 4 videos I'm going to play, it's all in the scriptures. So we listen to what they say, and we filter through the scriptures. And we in a beautiful time, man, watching Yahweh Shema Shai work, making their own tongue to fall upon themselves. And he mentions how America don't use no strategies. They don't got no integrity when it comes to making war. Because you're going against your allies, which is going to be America's enemies. This is that in Daniel 7, his look was more stout than his fellows,
camp on the banks of the
which
Rhine
meaning
River. That's all
their
nonsense.
allies is turning
We
to
think we
enemies. That's
can
what this
come to an
is.
agreement. Well, that's very
America's
difficult for them to
allies
do.
is turning to their enemies.
And that makes it very hard
When we
on
done with these
President
videos,
Trump,
we're gonna get
because
the
President
precepts.
Trump doesn't seem to have the authority or the will to impose what he wants on the Europeans. And I think that's something that President Putin has counted on. Hasn't happened. I mean, I cannot imagine anybody in the previous, certainly 30 years ago in Europe standing up to the President of the United States and saying, no, Mr. President, we don't want Germany reunified. We don't want any change in NATO, or on and on. It's just impossible. We don't seem to have that kind of influence in Europe anymore. And by the way, we're not even sure that President Trump can impose very much on the House or the Senate, because the people that really control the House, the Senate, and ultimately the White House are agents of Israel. Now, that means that Zelensky, in particular, is connected to Israel and connected to New York City and the banks in London. Are they prepared to go along with a peace agreement that President Trump hammers out that may be more favorable to Russia than they would like it to be, because they all seem to be in a state of permanent hatred and hostility for Russia? Yeah, I just think at this point, let's see what happens. We certainly hope for an end to this disaster. Today, a friend of mine who's paid more attention to these things lately than I have sent me a note reminding me that today was the end of the Somme offensive in 1916. And that caused 420,000 casualties in the British Army, 200,000 casualties in the French Army, and 440,000 casualties in the German Army.
Over 1 million.
So I guess from the standpoint of the Germans, they won because they inflicted more damage on the British and the French than was inflicted on them. But then you stop and you ask the question, what was achieved by the losses of all those lives? And I think we can say comfortably in retrospect, not much. But of course, here's something else that needs to be borne in mind. When that ends, there begins in London, it was already underway, but now it really begins a very deliberate effort to drag the United States into the war. Because it becomes clear in London and Paris that without our entry into the war, they are not going to win. And so this is the beginning of everything that goes wrong in the history of European civilization, in my judgment. We get into it. We should never have gone into that war. The British were insane to do it. We were even dumber to do it. And once we got into it, we made a mess of it, because we had a president who simply didn't understand Europe, didn't understand the world, and thought that he was God and would impose his solutions on the rest of the world. We're still in Europe. We're still in the Middle East. All of these places. Somebody pointed out to me the other day, and I think this is something Americans can't even begin to imagine, but at Versailles, people representing Syria, in other words, indigenous people, the people that lived in Syria, inquired whether or not the United States could receive the mandate for Syria instead of the French. And they were asked why. Well, we trust Americans. And we think the Americans want what's best for us. I mean, just stop and think. Can you find anybody in the Caucasus or the Middle East who's prepared to stand up and say such a thing to us today? It's tragic. So we're at the end of this long period of misery and misfortune, 100 years plus, and we see no immediate end in sight. So the possibility that something good comes out of the back channels between Putin and Trump, through their intermediaries, obviously, is something we should all welcome. But we have to be reasonable in our expectations. We have to suppress them, if you will, and keep in mind that even if everything seems to work out right at the last minute, it could all fall apart. And the question, of course, for you is, what does this mean for Armenia?
Yes.
Does Armenia fall into this confusing mix? Because one of the things that was pointed out today, I was astonished anybody would say it, said, well, after President Trump's successful ceasefire in the Middle East, this is a new opportunity for greater peace and cooperation, that it results from yet another ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. I don't see any ceasefire working at all in the Middle East. The Israelis bombed Lebanon again. One wonders, what are we doing that for? Of course, it doesn't make much difference what we think because the Israelis are in charge. Somebody sent me an interesting cartoon. It says, the president we voted for, and it shows a picture of Donald Trump. The president we got, it shows a picture of Netanyahu. I mean, this is the sort of undercurrent of discontent in the United States now, which is quite profound. But we are no more able to influence what happens in Washington as a people right now than, say, the Mexicans are to influence their own government, which really isn't in control of Mexico either. I mean, this is a just incredible set of circumstances. Whoever you think is in charge really isn't in charge. So if President Trump really isn't in charge, and you have a collection of billionaires, 6, 7, 8 billionaires with enormous quantities of money who've effectively purchased the government and policymaking, what can you reasonably expect to happen? Anything good? Can we come to some sort of arrangement with Iran? Doubtful. Can we prevent more war breaking out in the Caucasus? Now, obviously, if we can reach some sort of agreement with the Russians in Ukraine, I'm sure someone in the background is saying, well, if you ease up on the Russians in Ukraine, that will give them greater freedom of maneuver in the Caucasus. Do we want that? As though we have a permanent interest in harming Russia, which we don't. There's no strategic benefit to us from harming Russia. And then in the background, you have this thing called Venezuela. And everybody knows that the fentanyl comes into the United States via Mexico.
Yeah.
Everybody knows that the cartels in Mexico are dangerous and a serious problem. But then you have people that stand up and say, well, let's go bomb Mexico. I mean, it's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. No one wants to say we should protect our borders. We should shut down the drug and human trafficking coming up through the land borders and coming in from coastal waters. And then we should have harsh penalties for people involved in this. So I'm a big believer that if you are caught red-handed involved in child trafficking or drug trafficking inside the United States, you should be tried. And if you're found guilty, you should be executed. And every policeman I've talked to, everyone in law enforcement, everyone has said, absolutely, that will stop it. And I said, well, great, then why won't it happen? My assumption is there are people in Washington that must benefit from the illegal human trafficking and drug trade too. But of course, I can't prove that. But why would you not want something like that? And then, of course, you have the usual groups of, I'm a libertarian, I don't believe in that, that's not nice. Nice has nothing to do with it. It's the survival of your country. But instead, you have the other problem in the United States. It's what I call the bombs away club.
That's my favorite.
Yep. Now, oh, that's great. Let's go bomb them. That'll help, as though our greatness is demonstrated by bombing hapless opponents. No, it's not. So, what does this mean for you in the Caucasus? Has anything changed for the better in Azerbaijan? I haven't seen any evidence for it. And I think Mr. Putin has exercised considerable restraint there. The only thing that he has done is shut off a lot of the imports that sustained the organized crime networks that the Azeris had operating in southern Russia. But beyond that, I haven't seen much happen. Have you?
No, I think Russia and Azerbaijan went through a difficult period in their relations, but now they seem to be doing better. But since you're bringing this up, there was a peace agreement negotiated between Armenia and Azerbaijan by President Trump in August in Washington, and it was presented as a huge achievement, and I hope that it is. But so now Armenia is ceding its corridor, the southern border, a corridor from Azerbaijan to Turkey, to Trump's management. And very possibly Azerbaijan will have a share in that corridor. And American forces may be deployed on Armenia-Iran border in a country that already has a Russian military base. Does that strike you as a very stable situation if there is another confrontation with Iran to have American troops on an Iranian border in Armenia next to a Russian military base? Is this power keg, or how would you call this?
No, I think it's ill-advised. But then again, we have a government with no sense of limitations. In other words, something that characterizes Putin's thinking and behavior is a profound sense of the limits of Russian power and resources. He does not delude himself. But I'm afraid President Trump does. I think you have to keep in mind that that's because we are historically, and certainly in our mental outlook, a maritime power and an aerospace power. We are not really a land power. So there's no sense of the tyranny of distance and the problem with putting soldiers at risk in an area like that over which we have very limited control. Let's face it. I think it was a very dumb idea. I remember when I was involved in the Dayton Peace Accords, I was standing next to the senior military leader of the delegation, and he was getting instructions from Secretary Perry, who was then the Secretary of Defense. And Perry was a very, very sharp individual. And he said, now remember, certain things. First of all, we don't want, no agreement is better than a bad agreement. In other words, if we don't get agreement, it's because it's bad, that's okay. Secondly, we don't want any Danzig corridors. In other words, we don't want any non-contiguous island outposts somewhere. And then third, we don't want any commitment of U.S. ground forces on a permanent basis or even a semi-permanent basis in the Balkans. It's not an area of vital strategic interest to the United States.
Yes.
Hello, gosh, if only we had that kind of rationality and thinking going on. But what distorts our view of the world right now is really Israel. We are heart and soul bound to the Israeli state, and we are absolutely in the clutches of the billionaires in the United States who want us permanently committed to Israel. Whether we want to admit it or not, we really are committed to the Greater Israel Project. So even though the Israelis are continuing to kill Palestinians every so many days, hours, more Palestinians are killed, more infrastructure is destroyed. A friend of mine said, what is there left to destroy? Well, apparently there was enough left to destroy that they went in and destroyed more infrastructure. The events on the West Bank are picking up pace, and people there are being killed or driven out. So none of that has fundamentally changed. In fact, we're simply walking away from any discussion of it and pretending that there's a peace accord in place that's meaningful when it isn't. The disappointing part is that the Peninsular Arabs, with all of their money, seem to have turned away from the Palestinians and cut whatever deals they thought were appropriate that guarantee their continued survival and power and to enrich themselves in perpetuity. But there are a couple of interesting developments, and I'd appreciate if you would talk a little bit about them. Iran, of course, has turned into what people are largely describing as
so as he mentioned in that video about America being the hammer, this is Jeremiah 50 and 23. How was the hammer of the whole earth cut asunder and broken? And this is what he said. I'm just showing you, it's in the scriptures. How was the hammer of the whole earth cut asunder and broken? How was Babylon become a desolation among the nations? And then is this. He mentions this. He mentioned this, Isaiah 49 and 20. Therefore hear the counsel of Yahweh that they have taken against Edom, and his proposals that he had proposed against the inhabitants of Teman. Surely the least of the flock shall draw them out. Surely he shall make their habitation desolate with them. Here's the precept to that as well, 2 Ezra 11:39. Are not thy it that remainest of the four beasts who I made to reign in my world, that the end of their times may come through them? That same precept in Jeremiah 49 and 20 is in Jeremiah 50 and 45, as it just read in 2 Ezra 11:39. Therefore hear ye the counsel of Yahweh, They have taken against Babylon and his proposal that he had proposed against the land of the Chaldeans. So in Jeremiah 49, it mentions Edom. So the modern day Chaldeans is the Edomites, the self-proclaimed so-called white man. Surely the least of the flocks draw them out. Surely he shall make their habitation desolate with them. As the video showed, the one I played before this, that Israel, well, how was it titled? Israel pulls America in war with Iran trap. Yeah, we watching this happen, man. Real time. So he also mentioned, but I'm going to play the next video first before I pull them precepts. But he mentions how there is no more, he said that America ain't using strategy. They ain't using real logic before they do the things that they doing concerning their allies. So I'm going to read these two. This is Proverbs 15 and 22. It reads, without counsel, proposals are disappointed, but in the multitude of counselors, they are established. This is Proverbs 20 and 18 to precept that. Every purpose is established by counsel, and with good advice make war. But as the colonel said, America ain't no more wisdom, man. Which is, matter of fact, let me get them. So first is Isaiah 29 and 14. It reads, therefore, behold, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among his people, even a marvelous work and a wonder, for the vision of their wise men shall perish, and the understanding of their prudent men shall be hid. Which you're talking about Israelites first, but now it applies to the so-called white man. Jeremiah 49 and 7. Concerning Edom. See, that's how you can link Isaiah 29 and 14 to the so-called white man. Concerning Edom, thus saith Yahweh of hosts, is wisdom no more in Teman, his counsel perished from the prudent. Is their wisdom vanished? So if the Lord removed the wisdom from Teman, the rest of these Edomites ain't nobody, man. They nothing.
Increasingly an impregnable fortress.
In 19,
it's becoming something that if you attack it, you're probably not going to be successful. I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and will bring to nothing you
the
risk being
understanding
destroyed if you
of
do.
the prudent.
That means that Israel can do nothing without us, because if we're not going to join in at their and make ourselves available to them, there's no chance for success against Iran. But there's something else happening, and the Israelis are now talking openly about, over the long term, they think the most dangerous enemy they face is Turkey. This is an undercurrent inside Israel, fear of the Turks. Now, I happen to have agreed with them. I said when my many trips to Israel, you continue to focus on Iran. Iran is not what you think it is. 40 years have passed. The place has changed. Conceivably, you could do business with them and get along with them. Of course, the Israelis, if they can't dominate you, they don't want to do business with you. And I said, you've got to watch Turkey. Turkey is not what it appears to be. Ataturk has long since vanished. You have a different regime in power, and the population is very hostile to Israel. Well, now they've begun to pick up on that. What is the impact of an increasingly hostile Turkish state to Israel on Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Russia in the Caucasus?
I could offer some of my thoughts, but of course you would certainly know much more than I do. It seems that with this new corridor and Armenia submitting to Turkey and Azerbaijan and Russia being forced out, or that's what the West would like to happen, we may have a super Turkey. We may have a super powerful regional, potentially even a global power, as Erdogan would want it to be. Turkey basically fusing with Azerbaijan or creating some kind of a confederation because they're saying we are one people, two states. Then you have a super powerful state on three seas, on the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, the Caspian, the strategic importance of the straits, plus the huge Turkish military, plus
And this really shows how deep Yahweh Bahashim Yahweh Shai is in the simplicity of Yahweh Shai, because they are not using wisdom to be they are not using wisdom to be wise, man. They're supposed to be using wisdom to move wisely. And they are not, because they can't, because the Lord say, when you read Isaiah 10, the Lord said he created the self-proclaimed so-called white man just for a tool. He's just a tool. He's just a weapon of war, man. So it's heavy because the Lord say he removed, concerning Edom, he removed their wisdom. And you supposed to be wise. You supposed to have wisdom when you making wise moves. But they don't have no wisdom. The Lord said he used them as they just a tool for judgment. Ecclesiasticus 16 and 23 reads, he that wanteth understanding will think upon vain things, and a foolish man erring imagine of follies. So that's Ecclesiastes, right? Folly set in great dignity. Why? Because the so-called white man can only think on wickedness. Ecclesiastes 10 and 5. There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, as an error which proceeded from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity. So these devils, in Job, this is Job 28, verse 12. But where shall wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Man knoweth not the price thereof, neither is it found in the land of the living. So, but they go to the John, which I always bring this out when I read that, John 3 and 27. John answered and said, a man can receive nothing except it be given him from heaven. So that's at Deuteronomy 32, and the Lord said he's going to rain his doctrine down. The Lord ain't giving it to the self-proclaimed white
It's
man.
the gas and oil reserves of Baku. That's going to be an incredibly powerful regional force.
So all they can do is
it's going to collide with someone. That someone could be Russia, that someone could be Iran or Israel. Which direction that's going to go in, I think, you would know more about it. I think the U.S. will probably not allow two of its closest allies to collide, and would probably facilitate some kind of a sphere of influence agreement, whereby they would just divide up the region and agree on some buffer zones and some spheres of influence. I would think, that's my speculation, that the U.S. would not allow Israel and Turkey to collide. It's the closest; these are the two closest allies of the U.S. in this region. I think they would just make sure they divide it up to push Iran and Russia out. That's what I would think.
Well, I think ideally that's probably what the Israelis would like.
Yes.
But the Turks have a problem with that, and that is that they are doing a land office business with Russia. The Russians are building critical infrastructure inside Turkey, not the least of which is a nuclear power plant.
Yes.
And they want to continue to do business with the Russians. The other thing is that while we are still viewed as powerful, they live next to Russia.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between the United States that has to travel thousands of miles, assemble forces, and then launch attacks, and Russia that commutes to the fight. Russia is there.
Yes.
And I went back with somebody, we were trying to count the numbers of wars between the Ottoman Turks and the Russians, dozens.
Yeah, more than a dozen.
And they were almost always disastrous for the Turks. And I don't think the Turks want to have a war with the Russians under any circumstances. Now, you've had Mr. Netanyahu publicly threaten Russia and Putin on more than one occasion, saying that, we're not afraid of you, and if you do X, Y, and Z, we could respond. I think it's been made clear that the Israelis take the same view of Erdogan in Turkey. I think the Israelis are riding, to be blunt, as we say in English, very high in the saddle. They've got us under their thumb, and as long as they do, they think they can do and get away with anything. So this condominium of interest that you described between Turkey and Israel, which is an artificial construct birthed into existence by the United States, that could crumble quickly. You have members of Netanyahu's cabinet talking openly about seizing Damascus. The Israelis have pushed to the very limit in southern Syria, and the Israelis, as you know, are strong backers of the Kurds, as are we. But frankly, the Israelis are even more important to the Kurds than we are, because they provided them with technology, with weapons, and help, and so forth. So the Kurds are sort of astride this corridor that runs from Israel all the way up to Azerbaijan. They're in the middle. The Kurds are going to cooperate as long as it's in their interest to do so. At the same time, you've got Mr. Erdogan, who regards the emergence of a de facto Kurdish state as an existential threat to the Anatolian Republic. I guess what I'm pointing to is I'm reluctant to make any long-term forecast other than potential disasters around the corner.
Yes.
And we are not as strong as we appear to be.
Yes.
You look at China right now and Russia, and I would add India to this as well. They have an interest in managing American decline. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, in some ways, we are viewed as this potentially destabilizing power that comes in like a bull in a china shop and destroys a lot of China, then, declares victory and leaves, if you're lucky. In most cases, we never go home. We stay. So the Russians and the Chinese don't want a war with the United States under any circumstances. So they look at us and say, how do we manage this dangerous, unstable, unpredictable, irrational power called the United States, particularly as it tends to be on the way down? Remember that was the view that many people had of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. And that became pretty clear in the 1700s. I mean, frankly, after the Treaty of Karlowitz, and the defeat of the Serbs, the Turks in front of.
So I'm gonna go to this next clip. Hey, it's heavy because he mentioned the globalist elites, man. And you can't help but mention the globalist elites, man. Look at this. What's next? The collapse has begun. The West has entered
By the Ukrainians
collapse
down there.
phase. Let's go to this next. I got a couple more clips I want to play.
The Greater Israel Project has no chance of success. And I think Mr. Netanyahu knows this, unless they can ultimately balkanize and destroy Iran.
Inevitable.
So the war has to continue. There's no question about that if you're an Israeli. On the other hand, I'm not sure exactly when. I know that a lot of materiel, theater high altitude air defense missiles and equipment are being shipped to Israel. So I know we're busy trying to assist the Israelis with regard to defending themselves. And of course, they have limitless ammunition from us and whatever else they need. I know the Russians have been on the ground in Iran trying to repair, restore, and ultimately improve their integrated air defenses. So a war is inevitable in terms of, happening again. We just don't know exactly when. And these evacuations from Iraq are interesting because I remember when President Trump was president the first time around in 2020, when I was working for him, he was very interested in getting us completely out of Syria and Iraq. And of course, he was obstructed at that point. So for this to happen suggests that something is indeed building, but none of us knows when or how it will happen. I don't think President Trump, who is certainly not a student of European history, culture, economics, geography, ever really understood the complexity of the issues in Ukraine. I don't think he completely grasped what he was dealing with. Whether or not he does now is open to question, but he certainly did not until he got to Alaska. I think you're raising a very important question. If you're sitting in Moscow and you're looking at events, you're saying, well, first of all, we had a good meeting with President.
And see, this is why I read. This is why I read 2nd Ezra 11:39. It reads, Are not thou it that remaineth of the four beasts, who I made to reign in my world, that the end of their times may come through them? Who is the them? The revived Roman Empire, America, Babylon the Great, the small hats, that the end of their times may come through them. See, these scriptures hidden hard. Jeremiah 50. No, let's read Jeremiah 49:20 first. Because it gives Esau, it calls Esau out by name. Jeremiah 49:20. Therefore hear the counsel of Yahweh, that he have taken against Edom, and his proposes that he have proposed against the inhabitants of Teman. Surely the least of the flock shall draw them out. Surely he shall make their habitation desolate with them. Same thing in Jeremiah 50, but it mentioned Chaldeans, which is talking about the Edomites. The self-proclaimed so-called white man is the modern-day Chaldeans, the elites. And you heard Colonel Douglas said, the globalist elites. Jeremiah 50:45, therefore, hear ye the counsel of Yahweh, that he have taken against Babylon, and his proposals that he had proposed against the land of the Chaldeans, the modern-day Edomites. Surely the least of the flock shall draw them out. Surely he shall make their habitation desolate with them, like it said in 2nd Ezra 11:39. Let's read it again. 2nd Ezra 11:39.
Trump and his team. Remember, they met previously in Saudi Arabia, and on both occasions, both teams said they'd made some progress.
Come through them. Look at this. Look at this. Iran's red line. Cross it and it goes nuclear. This is
the direction of normalizing relations and we know with Russia, ain't gonna happen, and that's something that President Trump has said he wanted to do.
Be made
however, but having done that,
we hear, man.
That, of course, did not address Ukraine, and I think he decided that, you know, I can't fix Ukraine. I can't solve this, which is something he should have understood from the beginning. I think he does understand that. On the other hand, I think he's being advised by people who are telling him, well, you can't just walk away. And remember, that was what I urged from the beginning, you know, very early on to President Trump was, look, let's leave this. Announce you're suspending all further armaments. You know, we'll send humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainians. But the best way to end this war is to stop the flow of cash and weapons to Ukraine. At that point, the war has to stop because the Ukrainians really are at the end of their tether as it is. The Russians will then begin to take us seriously. I think he's been urged by everybody on the Hill and elsewhere not to do that. In other words, he's turned out to be like too many politicians, George. He wants to be a little bit pregnant. So he's straddling the proverbial fence. Now, this latest announcement is horrific. The notion that we would send thousands of cruise missiles over there is insane to begin with. Secondly, it's not going to happen very quickly because we can't build that many in the time that remains for Ukraine. So I think the Russians are looking at this and saying, we don't have any choice anymore. We've got to end this war. So we're going to press ahead. Now, what does press ahead mean? Well, they've already got special operations forces on the outskirts of Odessa. They've already destroyed all potential military targets in and around Odessa. They're going to move towards Zaporizhzhia. They're going to get complete control of Kherson, all of the areas in southern Ukraine. There's no choice in that matter. And eventually, I think we'll see them occupy Odessa. I've always felt that way. They've said that for the last 3 years. And you'll remember that Russians were herded into buildings in Odessa and then burned alive by the Ukrainians down there. That's something the Russians have never forgotten, and I would not forget that either. So I think those things are on the table. The question is, do you cross the river in strength and go north to Kiev. In other words, you eliminate the cancer because they don't want to refight this war in the future. And now it seems that MI6 in London is very interested in pushing this man Zaluzhny, who is ostensibly their puppet. That's not going to fly with Moscow. They will not accept that under any circumstances. And then finally, at least President Trump has now said, as I understand it, there will be no U.S. forces on the ground in Ukraine. Now, we've had this confusion over the last several days. Well, we may do this, we may not. I'm hearing he says no. The president of Poland, who is very much an important actor in all of this, has said no Polish troops on the ground in Ukraine. And as I've said from the very beginning, you didn't have Poland at this summit in the White House. Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, they border Ukraine. They are key to the outcome. They've been treated as though they're second-class citizens, irrelevant. They have to be on board for whatever happens in Ukraine. So I think that summit in the White House was a serious mistake. You called them the Seven Dwarves. The people that came in there were a disaster because they have nothing at stake. What they say is irresponsible. Starmer talking about what? 30,000 British troops? Good luck. The British Army, as you and I both know, is a shadow of its former self. It's in bad shape. It's really tragic. The same thing is true in France. As a friend of mine in the French Army says, the only thing we're prepared to do is go on safari in Africa. So there's 60,000 troops. And then I listened to a British analyst who came on, and I've forgotten his name, but he explained that you would have to have at least 300,000 troops that would operate effectively along the border of Ukraine to guarantee anything. And then finally, the Russians have said, if you move any troops in there from Western Europe, that's a red line for us. You make yourselves a co-belligerent, we'll attack you. So where are we? I think we're where we thought we would always be for months. And every time I've talked to you, this has come up, really. Who is going to determine the outcome? Russia. How will it be determined? On the ground in Ukraine. End of discussion. And in the meantime, NATO is falling apart. Anybody who thinks that's robust and capable is crazy. The same thing is true for the EU. If you live in Hungary and Slovakia and Poland, you're being told you need to accept 1 million people from Africa, the Middle East, and Southwest Asia. These people have said, no, thank you. We're not interested in that. We see what's happened in Great Britain. We've seen what's happened in Germany and Italy and France. We don't want that here. Everything is falling apart in the West. Nothing is working. So in the final analysis, Russia is winning this war, and it will determine the outcome. We won't. I think the nation of Ukraine, if we want to call it that, is in ruins, thanks to this man Zelensky and his backers in Washington and London primarily. Now, if you look at Poland right now, the Polish president, in addition to saying we're not going to send any more troops to Ukraine, they sent several thousand over there. They lost at least 2,000 killed trying to help the Ukrainians. They've said no more, out of the question. They've got several million Ukrainians in Poland. 1 out of 5 of them is applying for citizenship in Poland. So the Poles are now struggling with this because Poland is not that large a country. They've already got 40 plus million. They would like most of these Ukrainians to go home. And you're right, in Austria, where they have a lot of them, people are on the streets saying, stop importing, start deporting. Now, they're not just talking about unwanted Ukrainians, they're talking about large numbers of people from overseas that are non-Europeans. But your point is absolutely valid. This is a disaster. Now, I said a couple of weeks ago when I was asked 1.8 million had been killed and I was viciously attacked. Now they're saying 1.7. It's actually over 1.7. My sources are Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian. And what they try to do is the following. They try to read all the obituaries, actually visit the cemeteries, visit the hospitals, and more important, some of them have had the opportunity through commercial satellite coverage to find the mass graves. You were talking about people being killed and not reported. There are mass graves in eastern Ukraine of Ukrainian soldiers. Literally thousands in these graves, essentially bulldozed into the dirt and forgotten because the regime doesn't want to do what you described. And remember, you have so much corruption inside this military. If you want to be evacuated from the battlefield, you have to pay somebody in an ambulance to drive you to a hospital. What kind of an evacuation system is that for a military establishment? Ukraine is destroyed. It's finished. If President Trump really understood any of this, he would do what I said to begin with, simply suspend the aid, say this regime is not legitimate, it's over. But he refuses to do that. You know, we have a similar situation, as you're well aware, in the Middle East. I think if President Trump really understood the reality on the ground in Gaza, he would stop supplying the Israelis, but he can't do that. He refuses to do that. We are prisoners of all sorts of forces right now in the United States, none of which are in our interest. Some of these are big donors, some of these are political, industrial, but they're all bad. So the only conclusion I think most Americans can reach is we're not represented in Washington. Our government is divorced from us. I think you and many of your fellow citizens are reaching a similar conclusion.
For sure. Now, earlier I interviewed your friend and mine, Larry Johnson. He was, as always, in tropical splendor. I wondered if he was on his way to Venezuela. And I asked him if he'd feel safe going to Venezuela. Is Trump really going? We talked about the 7 dwarfs. He's got 7 warships off the coast of Venezuela and 4,000 Marines. What are they doing, Colonel?
Well, there are 7 warships. I don't know if there are 4,000 Marines. I was told there are 4,000 Marines and sailors. That's not exactly an invasion force. But I must tell you that I see a tremendous amount of resemblance between Maduro and Saddam Hussein. If you put them side by side, they begin to look a lot alike. And we're seeing the same playbook applied. Demonize Maduro the way we demonize Saddam Hussein. You know, even though privately you can find a lot of people that will say, damn, we should have left Saddam Hussein in charge in Iraq. We were better off then than we are now. That may be true, but the problem with Maduro is very simply, he has a very large country. This place is the size of France and Germany combined. Only got 26 million people, but millions live on the coast in those big cities. However, and this should not be overlooked, it's probably 3rd in the world, maybe 2nd now, I don't know, in terms of reserves of oil and gas. But they have very, very expensive, let's say, luxurious emerald mines and gold mines as well in Venezuela. So I suppose if you look at all of that against the backdrop of what we're discussing with another Saddam Hussein episode, it's not impossible that we could be headed there. Well, to some extent, you have to admit that what's good for the goose is good for the gander. In other words, we've done these things to the Russians in countries that border them. We've been up to all sorts of malevolent activity in Central Asia, in places like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, as well as obviously Ukraine, also now in Azerbaijan, which we see as helping Israel on the one hand, encircle and potentially harm Iran, but on the other side of that coin, Azerbaijan helps us break off Iran from Russia and the One Belt, One Road program, the infrastructure project that provides for rail transportation all the way to and from Iran from Shanghai. So there are a lot of things going on. So it makes sense that you would move into the Caribbean, into our soft underbelly. I keep watching Mexico very carefully because Mexico has always sided with whomever was against us. And I'd be very surprised if we don't see similar mischief down in Mexico. We ought to wake up and recognize the futility of what we've done in the Eastern Hemisphere and come to some sort of arrangement with both China and Russia in the Western Hemisphere. Having said that, though, I don't think the Russians or the Chinese are as foolish as we are. From the very beginning, it should have been obvious to anyone with half a brain that we could not fight and win any conflict against Russia on Russia's doorstep. That's just stupid. Strategically, it's an impossibility. We could not have defeated Germany if we had not had allies in the East as well as in the West to attack Germany during World War II. It would have been impossible. The Germans would have defeated us if we had only had the British as allies and attacked from the West. So the point is, I think Mr. Putin is going to be limited in what he's willing to invest in mischief in the Caribbean directed at us. And I think the same thing is true for the Chinese. So they will give Maduro help, but they're not going to do for him what we've done for Zelensky, which is essentially unconditional support and unlimited funds. That's not going to happen. Nevertheless, it can do us a lot of damage, obviously. But right now, beware of something. 2 Russian bombers landed in Venezuela, and it was treated in Washington as though this was the beginning of a new world war. Well, that's absurd. First of all, neither of them were armed. Okay, let's be realistic. There's nothing happening down there that is so terrible that it threatens our long-term national security. The issue for us is drugs, and the drug trafficking and the human trafficking. You don't have to invade Venezuela to stop that. That can be done in other ways. So hopefully someone will wise up and recognize that. We just need to defend our borders. We haven't done that, George, and it's stupid.
Is he a well man, Colonel? Donald Trump? Is he a well man?
You know, I'm not a physician, and I can't evaluate. I just think that sometimes he's coherent and sometimes he's not. And I think that he's in a position where he operates on the basis of instinct and impulse. There is no long-term strategic goal in mind. That's the problem. There's no coherent national strategy, whether it's industrial, economic, military, political. I see no long-term strategy. There was none under Biden. This is not a new phenomenon in the history of my country. The United States emerged from World War II suddenly with a lot of money, very wealthy, very powerful, lots of capability, and decided the world was its oyster. And we started meddling everywhere. Well, we're running out of money, running out of resources. We're running out of political credibility and legitimacy at home as well as abroad. It can't go on much longer. But my point is that when you have no strategy, any road takes you where you think you want to go. And so you've got a lot of people standing around President Trump, oh, forget Ukraine. That's a waste of time and money. Just do what you need to mollify Congress. Let's go after the real enemy in Venezuela. I'm sure that discussion's being heard in the Oval Office.